Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. This is now our second lecture in module number 6, looking at the broad topic of organizational structure. And in this video, as you can see from the title slide, what we're looking at is specialization and departments. Specialization and departments. Well, this really begins to answer the question, well, when I apply for a job as a data analyst, or as a sales manager, or as a software engineer, or whatever the job description is, why that job description? Why that role with those responsibilities? How does that work within the broader structure of the entire business? That's what we'll seek to answer in terms of this topic, specialization and departments. So let's define some terms now. Specialization, well, that's the basic answer to determining who will do what in a company. And departmentalization then is determining how people performing certain tasks, well, that's determined by the first part, specialization, right? Determining how people performing certain tasks can best be grouped together. This then is, as you see from the title of this slide, the basic building blocks of organizational structure. This all begins with the whole topic of specialization, job specialization. And you can see here, job specialization is identifying the specific jobs that need to be done and then designating the people who will perform them. Now, what this really has to do with is a whole topic of specialization that was actually first introduced all the way back in the 1700s, if you believe it. 1776, the famous book, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And one of the things he argues is that in a production facility, rather than having each person in the factory perform all of the tasks that's necessary to take raw materials into finished goods, in a process where there's several different steps, you shouldn't have one person do all the steps and then everyone around them also doing all the 17 steps necessary, for instance. Rather, you would be far more efficient and have far higher throughput and production if, instead, if you have 17 tasks needed to complete something, you had 17 different stations, people who specialize in just one or two of those tasks, and they get really good at it, and then they pass on the unfinished product to the next station for someone else who will specialize in that next step or next 2 or 3 steps. In fact, the seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, lays out the example where if it takes 17 steps, for instance, to take raw steel and make them into nails, rather than having a whole bunch of guys or gals doing each one of the 17 steps, if instead you had each person specialize in 1 or 2 in an assembly line fashion, well, quite frankly, your throughput of production would increase by a factor of 10 or 20. That's how great and how powerful the concept of job specialization actually is. This is why, by the way, you have so many specific and defined roles within a job. This is why, by the way, you have such specific and distinct jobs and job titles and roles in any organization today, because of the premise that was first given to us by Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, 1776. Now, once you have decided how specific jobs will be defined and described, the next stage is departmentalization, as you see here. That's the process of grouping jobs into logical units. Now, there's no perfectly right or wrong way how to group those jobs together. And you can see there are several different choices you have. You can group jobs together by product, or by process, or by function, or by customers they serve, or by geography. What has really become one of the best practices in departmentalization is to think of each group of jobs, each department, as its own profit center, as its own separate company unit responsible for its own costs, and profits. That's one way that you can easily track how efficient they are, how profitable they are in terms of contributing to the company, and how to improve their performance. Now, when we mention that you can departmentalize based on product or departmentalize based on customer type, etc., let's see if we can chat about that for a little bit. So you see here, functional departmentalization describes dividing or grouping together jobs according to their functions or activities, whereas, in contrast, product departmentalization describes grouping jobs together or dividing them based upon the specific products or services that are being created. And finally, process departmentalization divides jobs according to the production process used to create a good or a service. As we continue, customer departmentalization speaks about dividing jobs up to offer products and meet needs for identifiable specific customer groups. And finally, geographic departmentalization divides jobs according to the areas of the country that they serve. Now, I understand if these last couple of points have all been sort of a word salad, and maybe the easiest way to describe this to you is to show it to you graphically. And of course, we have a graph for you, or I wouldn't have mentioned it. So, figure 6.2 from the textbook shows you a company that has, quite frankly, multiple forms of departmentalization and provides a good way for us to compare and contrast what these different forms of departmentalization look like. So, if you look at this company, the standard organizational chart that we talked about in the last lecture, you can see here, you have a president of the company, and reporting to the president, you have 3 vice presidents. Those 3 vice presidents, the vice president of marketing, the vice president of production, and the vice president of finance. And just the fact that you have those 3 vice presidents reporting to the president is an example of functional departmentalization. You see that labeled on the right, right? So you have already created departments based upon their function. Finance is a different function than marketing, is a different function than production. And that's how that works out. That's what functional departmentalization is trying to describe. Now, as we go further down the org chart, you see the vice president of production has 3 managers reporting to him. You see them in the teal boxes there, right? You have the Texas plant manager, the Oregon plant manager, and the Florida plant manager. Apparently this company has at least 3 production plants in these 3 different states, and that, as you see on the right, is an example of geographical departmentalization. This is another way to segregate jobs, to departmentalize jobs. You can see here, for whatever reason, production feels it's most efficient and effective to departmentalize based on geography. Now, let's keep going. You can see that each of those plant managers in the teal are responsible for at least 2 different departments: consumer products and industrial products. Each one of them, right? You see that there, and that is an example of product departmentalization. Now, let's talk about that a little bit. Product departmentalization should make perfect sense to us because we realize if you have a company that is producing and selling 2 distinct classes of products, products that are sold direct to consumers and products that are aimed at industrial types of customers, you realize that the types of products could be wildly and significantly different. The sales process and sales cycle would be entirely different if you're selling to consumers versus selling to commercial industrial types of customers, right? The marketing collateral will be different. Quite frankly, the distribution may be completely different. You may be very, very distinct different processes. And therefore, in that org chart you saw, product departmentalization makes perfect sense, right? Now, you also realize that geographic departmentalization can also make perfect sense, right? Because the plant in Texas versus the plant in Florida versus the plant in Oregon may have very, very different needs. You're hiring people from different work pools. Depending on the products they're making and actually producing, they may have different production cycles. They may be utilizing different supply vendors. There's maybe significantly different ways of doing business just by virtue of the states that they're in, and therefore geographical departmentalization can also make very good sense in the right context. And finally, as you saw in that org chart at the top there, functional departmentalization, well, that for obvious reasons can make very good sense because those three functions we saw, marketing, production, and finance, are three very, very different disciplines, and they have their own staffing needs, their own budget needs, distinctly different activities. And so you can see that, well, not only functional, but product and geography departmentalization can make very, very good sense depending on the organization, right? So you can see here the basic building blocks of organizational structure, how you specify jobs in job specialization, and then once you've done that, how you group them together in departments in such a way as to build an organization that is flexible, yet efficient and effective, and maximizing their resources, including human resources, to produce products or services in the best, most straightforward fashion possible. That's the goal of organizational structure, and it rests upon these two principles: job specialization and then departmentalization. Some pretty big decisions there for any organization. I hope this is helpful. More of this in the textbook, of course, for you to read up on and study. We'll see you in the next lecture.